the Senate abortion bill, Finland and Sweden joining Nato, and the Biden economy. I'm Cecily Fernandez, and this is A Square Circle. Hello and welcome to The Square Circle. I'm your host, Cecily Fernandez. Joining us today are Libertarian Dan Mitchell of the Center for Freedom and Prosperity. Dan, great to see you.
Thank you.
Conservative and Chief Economist at Liberty Works Australia, Darren Nelson. Darren, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And progressive political reporter, James Rosen. James, wonderful to see you.
Good to see you, Cecily.
Welcome to everyone. This week, a bill that Democrats say would have codified the Roe v. Wade decision died in the Senate. Here's a story from CBS News.
The motion is not agreed to.
Even with Vice President Kamala Harris presiding, Senate Democrats fell short of the 60 votes needed to advance the Women's Health Protection Act to enshrine abortion rights into federal law.
The Senate failed to stand in defense of a woman's right to make decisions about her own body.
Democrats argue the measure would codify Roe v. Wade by preserving access to abortion services, while Republicans declared it too extreme.
Dan, are you surprised that Democrats failed to pass this bill?
I'm not surprised because they weren't just trying to codify Roe v. Wade. They were trying to go way beyond that. They could have had votes of two Republican senators, Murkowski and Collins. They could have had Manchin's vote if they simply codified Roe v. Wade. But Chuck Schumer apparently is worried about a primary challenge from the AOC wing. And he decided to have the Democrats go whole hog on something that was way beyond, allegedly, abortion up to 8 months and 30 days. So it made it impossible for the more middle of the road senators to support him.
Darren, what are your thoughts on the failure of Democrats to pass this bill?
Well, look, I don't think it's any surprise, really. I would pretty much agree with what Dan's assessment on this is. I think the Democrats are just very happy to kind of fight this out as an election issue. I think, they see it as something that's going to really gear up their base. They hope that might at least sort of cause the damage that may be happening in November to be less, or maybe they even think they might be able to win because of this.
James, would you agree with that assessment?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of questions tied to that question, one of which is, why, when the Democrats had huge majorities in the House and the Senate, back in the day, and had a Democratic president, for instance, under Lyndon Johnson, to go back a ways, and since then, without, I guess, a Democratic president and the huge majorities, but when they had huge majorities, why didn't they had large enough majorities, they could have overcome a veto even from a Republican president, but why didn't they pass a bill then? Why now, under this kind of pressure, are they making this decision? And a corollary question is, they're coming out, they're not supporting Senator Collins' bill. I think Murkowski's on that bill, Senator Murkowski as well. Senator Collins is the lead sponsor. She, of course, is a, somewhat moderate Republican, centrist Republican. And I don't really know. It's been moving so fast. I don't know what's in her bill, but apparently her bill does protect freedom of choice, perhaps to a little bit more restricted degree. But I do think we're seeing politics being played on both sides. And I agree with, I think it was Dan who said that this will be, given that polls show that Americans support freedom of choice for women by a 2-to-1 margin, you would think this would help Democrats in an election season that otherwise doesn't look good for them. The last election in 2020, women, and especially suburban women and Black women, basically won the election for Joe Biden. And I would think that this will, women support abortion by a larger margin than 2-1. I would think that this could be, a winning issue for them. But things are moving very fast, and there's still a lot to play out.
Also this week, Finland and Sweden made moves toward NATO membership. Here's coverage from France 24.
After months of deliberation, Finnish President Sauli Niinistö and Prime Minister Sanna Marin have endorsed Finland to join NATO, setting the stage for an imminent membership application.
Finland must apply for NATO membership without delay. We hope that the national steps still needed to make this decision will be taken rapidly within the next few days.
The country's foreign minister echoed the statement in his address to the EU Parliament.
Unpredictable behavior of Russia is an imminent issue. Russia has the ability and readiness to put pressure on its neighbors.
Until now, Finnish leaders saw NATO membership as an unnecessary provocation of Moscow. But since the war in Ukraine, Finland has made a gradual U-turn from its 70 years of neutrality towards its Russian neighbor, with whom it shares a 1,300-kilometer border. Consensus has also shifted in Finland's closest defense partner, Sweden, who is expected to move in tandem with Finland's decision.
James, what do you think about this development and the potential impact on the war in Ukraine?
I think it would be a bombshell. I think, ironically, Pope Francis said a few days ago that NATO had provoked Putin by barking at Russia's door. I think that was the quote. There's an element of truth to that. And I'm not saying it justifies the invasion of Ukraine. Obviously, it doesn't. But Russian and Soviet leaders going back to World War II, or post-World War II, when NATO was formed, have said uniformly that eastward expansion of NATO toward their borders would be a huge problem. And so this is not something that Putin invented. And Finland and Sweden have both had problems with Russia and Soviet Union historically, especially Finland. But they've been, neutral in recent decades. I think them joining NATO would be a bombshell. The irony here is that Putin is creating the very, in the Russians' view, the kind of nightmare scenario that he fears and that he so much doesn't want, by being, not only by invading Ukraine, but being so brutal about it. It's just natural that other bordering neighbors of Russia would, think, am I next? And look for protection. That's just natural. So it's, he has miscalculated. He obviously miscalculated in the invasion itself. He miscalculated in terms of the ability of his forces to carry out the war, and he's miscalculated on this front. So I think it would be a bombshell. I think it might lead to U.S. being even more involved in this war than we are. We already are with intelligence. And if I could add one thing, I was very disappointed in was it Politico or the New York Times? I was very disappointed in the publishing of the fact that we're supplying key intelligence to Ukraine, helping them sink the ship and helping them target Russian generals. I think that's really disturbing on the part of journalism. We didn't do things like that during World War II. We knew a lot of things that we held off on. And I think it's a separate issue, but I think that's a discussion that our leaders of journalism have to have.
Okay. Dan, what do you make of this development with Finland and Sweden joining NATO? Do you think that this, as James mentioned, would be a nightmare scenario for Russia?
It's definitely not good news for Russia. If they are as paranoid as people say they are about expansion of NATO, well, they're the ones who caused this. And now, by the way, what the Pope said is not something out of the wilds. Kissinger, lots of the foreign policy realists have warned for decades that NATO expansion might not be a good idea given the paranoia that the Russians have. Now, having said that, do I think Putin is a particularly brutal guy, and he has this vision that of a newly powerful Russia, where he thinks that Ukraine should have always been part of Russia anyhow? Yeah, he might have invaded even if NATO had never expanded. So I don't want to in any way excuse Putin. He is the bad guy here, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be thinking to ourselves, especially after this whole thing comes to an end. We should be thinking, well, what is the role of NATO in the future? Especially, I mean, with any luck, the oligarchs of the military take Putin out, and Russia can sort of become a normal country.
And Darren, what do you think as far as the role of NATO? I mean, I guess when people talk about the fear that Russia may have, I guess that, there's this understanding that, NATO, that Sweden and Finland might contribute to, helping, defeat Russia. What do you think about that? What do you think is a likely course of this war?
I don't think it's going to make any difference to this war unless it expands. And I think it'd be insane for either side to expand it. As it's been pointed out by many sort of, more knowledgeable commentators than I on this issue, Russia is the #1 nuclear power in the world. So, whether they're not a very good one or not, you don't have to be that good when you have a lot of nuclear arms. Perhaps their conventional army isn't as good as they thought or others thought. That's certainly a possibility. But I think there's also there's miscalculations on both sides. I think, like I said, I think NATO is far outlasted its usefulness, and they should be thinking about something different. And also by, pushing Russia into to me, the far more dangerous potential enemy of China is foolhardy. This seems to be just politics, mainly. Well, actually, it's politics not just from the Democrats, but some Republicans as well. Plenty of Republicans, and I think it's very short-sighted. We should be stepping back and thinking about the U.S.'s interests first and the Western alliance's interests as well. And I'm not sure how, prolonging this war in the hope that Russia will be weakened is really that great of an idea, considering. At the end of the day, you're letting a whole bunch of people in Ukraine suffer over this. I think that, Dan said, yeah, Putin's the bad guy. He's not the only bad guy in this. He's probably he's the biggest bad guy in this. But Zelensky and his crew, I don't have any empathy for them. I have a lot of empathy for the Ukrainian people, who are the ones who are really getting, shafted in this whole affair.
What has Zelensky done wrong?
Zelensky, well, first of all, he's gotten rid of all his political opponents in terms of their effectiveness. He's gotten rid of all the media except for one that are favorable to him, and he was put in, through Western powers in the first place. The guy's a mini dictator. He doesn't have the same level of influence of Putin, of course, but I mean, it's a complete false choice, as though like Putin's the bad guy and Zelensky's the good guy. No, we got two bad guys here. Putin's the bigger bad guy, yes. But, we should be stepping back and trying to end this conflict if we can, or help do our best to end it. We're extending it. We're thinking, we're going to take out Russia somehow through Ukraine. That's just absurd. I mean, you might bog the Russians down for, quite some time. I mean, I don't think it'll even become Afghanistan level of bogging down. I mean, this war has been going for a few months. I mean, do you expect the war to be over in 3 weeks? It's not, the Third Reich versus Poland here.
Well, finally this week, President Biden defended his economic policies and vowed to take on inflation. Here's the president.
There are two leading causes of inflation we're seeing today. The first cause of inflation is a once-in-a-century pandemic. Not only did it shut down our global economy, it threw the supply chains and demand completely out of whack. And this year we have a second cause, Mr. Putin's war in Ukraine. We saw in March that 60% of inflation that month was due to price increases at the pump for gasoline. Putin's war has raised food prices as well, because Ukraine and Russia, two of the world's major bread baskets for wheat and corn, are essentially completely stalled.
Dan, what did you think of President Biden's speech?
I guess it's sort of like an arsonist pledging to put out a fire. What's ironic about this is that if Biden actually understood economics, he could very accurately say, this is not my fault. This is the fault of the Federal Reserve opening the spigots when the pandemic started in early 2020. That's what caused the inflation that we're suffering from now. The Fed expanded its balance sheet by trillions of dollars. Dumping all that money in the system sooner or later does then show up in the form of rising prices. But of course, because historically people on the left have been what are called monetary doves, they weren't against it when it happened. So it's not like Biden can say, oh, this happened under Trump, because Biden, if he even knew what was happening, he would have supported it too. The bottom line is the Federal Reserve caused the inflation, and Biden is sort of the victim of it, although he certainly isn't doing anything to make it better. A lot of my Republican friends say, oh, Biden's spending is causing the inflation. No, monetary policy causes inflation. The only possible connection is if the central bank decides to monetize the government spending by buying a lot of government debt. But I don't think that's what the Fed was doing in 2020. They were just thinking that the pandemic recession was going to be like the 2008 recession, and they thought they had to dump a bunch of money in the system, and that turned out to be completely false. It was a completely different kind of economic problem.
Darren, what did you think of this speech?
Yeah, very similar thoughts to Dan. Biden claimed that the pandemic plus Putin essentially caused inflation, and Putin in two ways, on energy and food. Look, there's elements of truth to that, but really it was the pandemic policies and, in particular, what he's failed to do in the wake of really the pandemic going away. Just because the virus keeps on popping up doesn't mean that we still have a pandemic. And and then putting aside, obviously, how you should have responded to the pandemic in the first place, we'll just put that all off to the side. But what he's done since is he's made things worse. So Dan's completely right. Inflation is driven by monetary policy through the Federal Reserve and in partnership to some extent with the federal treasury, particularly if you start monetizing debt and all that sort of stuff. So that essentially ramps up demand on the demand side of things. Sort of putting upward pressure on prices. And then you throw in Joe Biden's, if you like, supply side dampening thing. So you have demand going up, and he's making things tough on the supply side through his sort of green oriented energy and food policies. Energy is obvious, renewables, or getting rid of sort of, the Trump sort of approach of letting people develop, sort of oil and gas here, and instead trying to rely on oil and gas from overseas. And then, yes, of course, the situation in Russia and Ukraine make it all far worse in that sort of context. But, if you look at the statistics, all the various, be it core inflation, food inflation, energy inflation, it's starting well before the war in Ukraine, well before. It's jacking up well before. And you can see it almost corresponding perfectly with Joe Biden's administration. Not to say, obviously, the Federal Reserve wasn't doing some bad things, for instance, under the Trump administration, because they were. But the Trump administration, sort of didn't then add to it the kind of the bad supply side sort of policies, and also throw in Joe Biden's labor policies as well, with, sort of throwing, quite generous welfare so that people aren't going back into the workforce in the same numbers. So that's also restricting supply. So those are the two, basically demand is pushing up prices, and the supply going down is also pushing up prices at the exact same time. So, most of it does fall on Joe Biden's plate, because ultimately the Federal Reserve isn't really an independent organization, and he has influence over it.
James, would you agree with that? And what did you think of the president's speech?
Well, talking about kicking a dog when it's down. It's, when a president has a 36% rating, it's so easy to criticize him. Something that I think Darren just said about the supply side. The pandemic started, I remember exactly when we went into lockdown. It started in March 2020. And that's when, that was more than 10 months before President Biden took office. And the money that on a completely bipartisan basis that Congress, with President Trump's blessing, pumped into. President Trump wanted more money pumped into the economy. I can't remember, but it was trillions of dollars. And And in terms of, people not going back to work and incentivizing them, paying them not to go back to work. Again, that started very soon after the pandemic, well before Joe Biden took office. And to some degree, it's just continued. It hasn't continued that much, not as much. One question I have is why nobody mentions the oil companies. I mean, food prices. I love to go to grocery stores and I shop. Yeah, food prices have gone up. I don't like it, but there's a discount gas station on the outskirts of the Washington, D.C. area in Northern Virginia where I get gas. I drive back and forth between Charlottesville and D.C. And gas a year ago at that gas station was $1.99 a gallon. Now at that gas station, it's $3.99. I'm not a great mathematician, but it seems like that's a doubling of gas prices. How is that possible? How is it possible that we've seen, almost a doubling of gas prices across the board when the inflation rate, that's a 100% increase in the price of gas? The inflation rate, according to the government numbers, has been more like 7%, 8%, something like that. Why does nobody mention the oil companies? I don't understand it. Gas is a big part of what we pay.
Dan, let's go to our economist. You want to talk to us about gas and the role that oil companies play?
Well, I guess the first thing to understand about inflation is that even if you have 0% inflation, there are always some prices that are going up relative to other prices and some prices going down. And this is one area where you might blame what's happened in Ukraine, cutting off and limiting certain energy supplies from coming into the market. So maybe that did play a role. But again, constraints on supply in one market, that's not the same as inflation, because if there's not more money chasing fewer goods, it doesn't matter whether one sector of the economy prices are going up, because that will be offset by other sectors of the economy where prices are coming down. So I don't want to excuse the Fed. The Fed deserves the blame for this.
But we're going to move on to some questions from our viewers. Bruce Williamson asks, do you think the American people are trending more pro-choice or more pro-life? And James, if I can start with you on that question, what do you think the trend is on abortion?
Boy, that's a tough question. That's maybe the toughest question I've been asked on this program. I don't really know. I mean, the opinion polls, it was said earlier on this show that it depends on how the question is asked by pollsters. Obviously, if you ask a question, it sounds like a Fox News question. Do you want restrictions on abortion? Well, Roe v. Wade has restrictions on abortion. There's not too many people in this country who would answer no to that question. No restrictions on abortion. That's kind of a silly question. But I think that abortion, the right of women to choose. Let's get away from abortion. The right of women to choose whether they have an abortion or not. That with some restrictions, that has been favored by a fairly large majority for decades now, and I think that because Roe v. Wade has been established law for almost a half century, I don't think women, even women who aren't particularly liberal, I don't think women are going to react very well. I think if Roe v. Wade is overturned, I understand that in half the states, abortion will still be legal. I think you're going to see women who have never been on the streets before. I think you'll see suburban women who have never protested. I think they will be out on the streets in force.
Okay. Dan, what about you as far as our viewer question? Do you think that the American people are trending more pro-choice or more pro-life?
I think the biggest thing that's happened in the United States is that we are getting more geographical segregation by ideology. There are some states that are now super red states and some states that are super blue states. And I think that's been more powerful in terms of where the public is on different issues than just what do they think on abortion in general. California, it's going to be, if they could legalize it in the fourth trimester, they would. Whereas, Mississippi, Heck, I mean, technically, I guess an IUD is causes an abortion. So maybe Mississippi tries to ban even that. So I'm sure some states will go too far on the pro-choice side. Some states may go too far politically on the other side. But I do think kicking it back to the states will eventually give us a relatively stable equilibrium, just like they have in Europe. In Europe, in France, the presidential election they just had, the whole fight was whether or not to take it from the 14-week limit now back down to 12 weeks. So, by American standards, that's a very restrictive policy, even though everyone thinks of France as being very socially liberal. So I think getting it back to the states is a way of actually detoxifying the issue for the American public.
Okay. And Darren, what do you think about this question of where the direction of the American people? Do you think it's trending more pro-choice or more pro-life?
Look, I agree with both James and Dan. It's hard to say overall, but I agree with Dan. That's really not the way to look at it. Like adding it all up, and okay, that's a kind of an interesting statistic, I guess. But it's more, what does it look like on a state by state basis? But I would add the political divisions aren't just state by state. It's really big cities, inner cities usually, versus everybody else, basally.
That's not true. That's not true. I mean, if you look at voting,
let me finish.
That's just not true.
Well, it is actually true. I've been traveling around the world, and that's the exact same division in the United States. It's the exact same division in Australia. It's the exact same division in the United Kingdom.
Are you including suburbs?
Exact same situation in Canada.
Where do suburbs fall?
Where have you lived? I've lived in throughout the Anglosphere, and I've seen the exact same division.
But where do suburbs fall in that stark division? Where do they fall?
That's what I'm saying. I'm saying suburbia, particularly the further you get out in suburbia, you're going to find far more people who are less in favor of abortions, because people are separating themselves politically. They're doing it all over the world, in particular the English-speaking countries.
We have our next viewer question, which is from Jill Dunn, and she asks, how likely do you think Putin is to attack Finland now that the Finns want to join NATO? And James, you want to take that question?
Well, I've been wrong about Putin several times in recent months, so I'm afraid to answer that question. His troops are failing in Ukraine. It's hard to imagine. It's hard to imagine him attacking on an opposite front.
Dan, what do you think? How likely do you think Putin is to attack Finland now that the Finns will be joining NATO?
I think it's very unlikely that Putin will go into Finland, if for no other reason that the Russian military has been exposed as extraordinarily incompetent. Most people in Washington expected Ukraine to fall the same way that Afghanistan fell to the Taliban after we pulled out. And instead, the Ukrainians, at 1/5 the size or 1/4 the size, are basically fighting the Russians to a draw. I don't think Putin has the ability to project force on two different fronts. So I'd be much more worried that some stupid mistakes will somehow lead to missiles flying over the Arctic rather than Putin going into Finland.
Okay. And Darren, how would you answer Jill's question?
Yeah, I think it's gone from, sort of 0% up to 0.01% now. There's really little chance of that for the reasons that the other people were talking about, plus some other ones as well. I don't agree. I think, Putin, I don't think he's a dumb man. I don't think he's certainly not crazy. Is he a bad man? Yes. But then again, I find most politicians fairly egregious, to be honest. They're just scales of egregiousness.
All righty. Well, it's now time for my favorite part of the show, the most underreported story of the week. James, would you like to share your most underreported story of the week with us?
I think I said last time I was on this show, maybe a couple of weeks ago, that my underreported story was that government and university experts about birds were telling people to no longer put food in bird feeders because of the avian flu. So we need to impose social distancing on our feathered friends. And I've just found out that a baby fox in Minneapolis tested positive for the avian flu. I didn't even know that was possible. Apparently, they think the fox ate a fowl that was infected with the avian flu, but it's the first known case of a mammal getting the avian flu. I mean, I guess, we human mammals get all kinds of different flus. I'm not sure we can get the avian flu. My ignorance on medical issues and science is showing here. But it kind of says to me it's kind of a big deal that if fox and other mammals start getting the avian flu.
Okay.
Maybe I'm paranoid because of having gone through 2+ years of pandemic. But.
Yes. Well, it's definitely an underreported story. So thank you. Dan, what about you? Do you have an underreported story of the week for us?
I'm not sure this is underreported since it's sort of breaking out into a lot of the media now. But this baby formula shortage is apparently causing huge angst and troubles for families with infants. And imagine how horrible that would be. For whatever reason, you can't breastfeed, you have to have formula, and all of a sudden the stores are empty. And in some states, apparently there's like 50% of the stores are out. And it's just a bizarre quirk of different factors in the supply chain and FDA regulation and things like that. And, there's not like there's one single blame for it, but it's something that for the people who are affected, it's going to be huge.
Yeah, definitely. Darren, what about you? Do you have a most underreported story of the week for us?
Yes, the Australian election. I mean, you don't really hear anything about it in the American news for the most part. That's I believe it's on May 21st is, the actual where they head to the polls, but obviously the campaigning's going on. It started off with currently the conservative governments in power. They're called the Liberals, the Liberal National Coalition. And the equivalent of the Democrats is the Labor Party. And, Labor started off with a pretty big lead. And then as the campaign got started, it just gets whittled down, mainly due to the extremely poor performance by the leader of the opposition for Labor. So now both parties are, well, actually more the Liberals and Coalition are pulling out the old big guns like John Howard, who was prime minister for about 200 years in Australia. I'm exaggerating, of course. So it might actually end up, it should be very close. And I think it might end up as what they call in the Westminster system, a hung parliament. So basically, no one will have an outright majority. I think at the very minimum in the Australian Senate, I think the small minor parties will control the balance of power, and perhaps the small right-wing minor parties. There's two in particular, the Liberal Democrat Party, which are essentially the libertarians, and One Nation and Family First, which are sort of Trumpish, kind of a combination. Well, Family First is kind of more Reaganish, and One Nation's kind of more like a Trump-style party. They could actually hold the balance of power in the Senate.
All right. Well, we'll have to keep an eye and check your predictions. So thank you for that. But that's all the time we have for this edition of the Square Circle. Thanks to our guests, and thanks to all of you for watching or listening to the Square Circle. I'm Cecily Fernandez. Please subscribe to our channel and like this video, or give it a 5-star rating on your podcast platform. We'll see you next week.